I'd like to begin this podcast by acknowledging the Yagara and the Turrbal people as the traditional custodians of Meanjin, the lands on which our podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging.
Hello, Academy Associates. Thanks for choosing to listen to the BodyTrack Academy podcasts, where our aim is to bring clinical research to real-life clinical practice. For further learning opportunities, why not access our educational webinars? To access these, click on the link in the show notes. To further keep up to date with what we offer, why not join our Academy mailing list where you'll receive exclusive content, discounts on webinars, and more. Again, you'll find a link in the show notes.
Hi all, I'm Mackenzie, one of the exercise physiologists working here at BodyTrack, and today I'm going to be chatting about high-intensity interval training, or commonly known as HIIT, and the implementation of this training mode in type 2 diabetes populations. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people as the traditional custodians of Meanjin, the lands on which our podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So first of all, I'll touch on the pathophysiology of type 2 diabetes. And we know that 90% of diabetes cases are type 2, and this is a result of malfunctioning of the feedback loops between insulin action and insulin secretion. And the organs involved tend to be the pancreas, so beta and alpha cells, the liver, skeletal muscle, kidneys, brain, small intestines, and adipose tissue. And we're getting more and more data suggesting that things like adipokine dysregulation, gut microbiota abnormalities, immune dysregulation, and inflammation have emerged as important and pathophysiological factors, and these are things we can influence with exercise. So the goal of our treatment tends to be managing glycemic measures and reducing cardiovascular disease risk so that we can achieve and maintain those optimal blood glucose levels, blood lipids, and blood pressure levels that prevent or delay chronic complications in people with type 2 diabetes. And what we tend to see is that we see changes in vascular stiffness and flow-mediated dilation, so our endothelial health. And this can lead to things like cardiac dysfunction, so we see changes in blood pressure and muscle dysfunction, meaning things like insulin action is affected and oxygen delivery and utilization in the muscles. And overall, we see changes in perfusion heterogeneity. So that's how responsive our cardiovascular system is to things like exercise. And if this is poor, we can see changes in functional capacity and exercise capacity. And overall, down the track, this is where we start to see changes in cardiovascular and increased risk in all-cause mortality as well. So we know that exercise can help to combat these things, and regular activity has been linked to enhanced beta cell function, so the secretion of insulin sensitivity, vascular function, and it improves function of our gut microbiota as well. In particular, we see enhanced insulin sensitivity, and this can last up to 72 hours post-exercise. We see acute increases in GLUT4, so this means we have increased glucose uptake into the muscles. And we can see reductions in oxidative stress as well. And this can be put down to increases in antioxidant enzyme release, which contribute to our endothelial health as well. And I think a really important thing to note, and something that's really good to fill our clients in on as well, is that aerobic fitness is an independent predictor of mortality for people with type 2 diabetes. So this means that the protective effect of higher fitness levels is independent of total body mass. So if we're looking at high intensity interval training and these protocols, the traditional protocols tend to be around that 10 seconds to 4 minute mark of on training or high intensity training. And we tend to have around anywhere from that 12 to 15 to 5 minutes of active or passive recovery within those bouts. And higher intensity marks tend to be up around the 75 to 90% of heart rate peak, or that 65 to 90% of VO2 peak as well. So there's a lot of range in protocol length, and the optimal protocols aren't yet known. And we're going to touch a little more on those traditional 4x4 minute protocols and some lower volume protocols as well later on in the podcast. So we know that high intensity exercise can lead to a moderate increase in oxidative stress, but this is a good thing. It can temporarily increase our antioxidative system as well. So this contributes to the anti-inflammatory properties of high intensity exercise. Faster muscle contraction contributes to increased glucose uptake. And we tend to see superior changes in aerobic fitness, which again we'll touch on later into the podcast. But this has a protective factor, which we know for cardiometabolic health as well as endothelial function too. And I thought a really interesting thing I found in studies involving HIIT was that women who reported at least one vigorous exercise session per week were 16% less likely to develop type 2 diabetes, regardless of their age and gender. So I think high intensity interval training is obviously highlighted as a really important training factor for people who are living with type 2 diabetes. So in terms of the protocols, the traditional protocol, I guess, that's often used in HIIT research is a 4x4 minute protocol. So 4 minutes of high intensity work, 4 minutes of an active recovery. But lower volume HIIT training or HIIT is emerging as a more efficient method. But this minimum dosage required to still induce physiological changes is not yet known. And I was involved in a study that looked at factors contributing to this and what that low volume might be, the sufficient volume might be, which I'll go through later on in the podcast as well. So some things we may have to consider in type 2 diabetes populations before we get into high intensity exercise. Things like their blood glucose levels prior to exercise, because we know that with high intensity exercise, it can reduce those levels more so than moderate intensity training. Any external lifestyle factors that may be contributing to increases in stress, so things like sleep and other lifestyle events that may be happening. And our health risk factors and cardiovascular disease in particular, so the presence of this disease. And this is probably something you'll identify in your screening process at an initial assessment. Another thing to consider is the age of the client as well. So the Look Ahead trial that looked at high intensity interval exercise, and they did ECG testing in comparison or in line with this training, and they found that age was the only predictor of prevalence of abnormalities in ECGs as well. And the other thing to consider is the timing of the appointment or when you're doing your HIIT training. So a research study found that there tend to be bigger reductions in blood glucose in the afternoon. And this was perhaps attributed to changes in thyroxine, which they found was reduced in the afternoon but unaltered during morning exercise. And the proposed mechanism was perhaps this is something to do with our circadian clock contributing as a key regulator of homeostasis in the body. And we must consider the relative perceived effort of the client in front of us too. So someone's 7 out of 10 will look very different to your 7 out of 10. And it could look different for that same client day to day as well. So this is really important, and something I tend to do with clients during HIIT training is go with an RPE initially. So find their 7, 8 out of 10. And then, for example, if we're doing HIIT training on a bike, I'll correlate that with an RPM value as well, so that we kind of have that objective measure to aim for when we're doing our HIIT training. And some green ticks, I guess, before that we can think of as a green light to go ahead with high intensity exercise is some things like participating in moderate physical activity. So if they're already doing that, that is a green light that we should try some HIIT. Their presentation is clinically stable. They've done an ECG stress test and they've been cleared for high intensity exercise. And the final one is under EP supervision. So with our supervision, that is a green light, which should be ready to roll. These green ticks are from a position statement from the American Diabetes Association as well.
Hey, thanks for taking the time to listen to our podcast. We hope you're learning a lot in this particular episode. Just a shout out to our sponsor, HGG Performance, which provide very high quality, innovative gym equipment and custom fit outs to enable you to pivot your potential and smash your performance and rehab goals. They are world renowned for their innovative creations in the gym accessory space, including the best selling ISO Tib LT, Tib Bar, Wrist Axe, and Nordic Bar. And I got to say, we're using some of these equipment in our clinic and finding some great results. Used by professional sports teams, athletes, and coaches worldwide, as well as the military, health practitioners, and apparently even Joe Rogan uses their gear. HGG is a proudly Aussie-owned company that makes all their gym equipment at their Gold Coast HQ. And our partnership with them, we are stoked to offer you 10% discount on any product with the code BODYTRACK10, so you can experience what all the hype is about yourself. So jump over to their website, go to the checkout, punch in the code of BODYTRACK10 to get 10% off on any of their great innovative gym equipment, and start using today. Thanks very much.
And if we are considering the evidence for HIIT, it is overwhelmingly positive in terms of the safety in this population and the effectiveness, particularly when compared to moderate intensity continuous training. So like I mentioned, those protocols tend to be the 4x4 minute HIIT training, and then the moderate intensity continuous training protocols tend to be that kind of 30-minute at around that 60% of VO2 max. And a systematic review found that they looked at changes in VO2 peak, so an indicator of aerobic fitness. They found that HIIT was superior in all articles within that systematic review at improving aerobic fitness or VO2 peak. So I think its effectiveness is not doubted in the research. It's superior for improving aerobic fitness, and therefore changing those cardioprotective factors or contributing to those cardioprotective mechanisms as well for people with type 2 diabetes. The other areas where they found superior adaptations compared to moderate intensity training was in our body composition as well. And I think this is important because if we can manage weight more efficiently with HIIT training, that can contribute to things like beneficial effects on our HbA1c, blood lipids, and blood pressure, which researchers found we need a weight loss of over 5% body weight to induce these changes or these beneficial effects. And we also found in the research that for every kilo of weight lost, I see a 16% reduction in diabetes risk as well. So that looked at the 4x4 minute protocols. I'm going to talk a little more about the lower volume HIIT protocols. And this was a study I was involved with down at Flinders University. What we wanted to look at is what was a minimal threshold of exercise that was needed to induce significant changes in physiological adaptations. And we looked at the primary measure of heart rate variability, or the heart rate variability index. And this is an indicator of sympathovagal balance. So this is something that contributes to things like autonomic dysfunction and cardiovascular disease risk. And it has been identified as a superior predictor of cardiovascular mortality risk as well. So this is the main or the primary measure we decided to focus on. And what we looked at was how people responded, or how the heart rate variability index responded to HIIT training. So we went through a few different protocols. We did the traditional moderate intensity continuous training, so 30 minutes of exercise at the 60 to 70% of heart rate max. We did a 4 HIIT protocol, so 4 lots of 4 minutes at the 85 to 95% of heart rate max, with 3 minutes of active recovery at 50 to 70% heart rate max in between. And then our low volume HIIT protocol was just 1 bout of 4 minutes at the 85 to 95% of heart rate max. And we identified responders within this protocol. So responders were anyone that presented with a positive change in heart rate variability index. And the reason we did this was that the research in this measure was quite limited at the time, and there wasn't yet a significant or a clinically significant value identified. And with our studies, we found that there were more responders to the 4-HIIT and the 1-HIIT protocol versus moderate intensity continuous training. And however, people with type 2 diabetes tended to have a blunted response. So what this looked like, and I will link this study for people who are interested and want to read more about it. But what we found is that people without type 2 diabetes were most likely respond to the 4-HIIT protocol. We had 91% of participants classified as responders. In the moderate intensity continuous training had 67% of participants be responders, and the 1-HIIT protocol, so that reduced volume protocol, had 58% likelihood of being a responder. So you can see that 1-HIIT protocol had a similar percentage of responders versus compared to the moderate intensity, which I think is a really exciting finding. I think if a 4-minute protocol, that higher intensity can have similar changes compared to a moderate intensity protocol of 30 minutes. And that's really important for the efficiency of our sessions and our exercise prescription as well. So that was in the type 2 diabetes population. And then that was in the diabetic population, and then people with type 2 diabetes, the percentages tended to be blunted. So for people in the moderate intensity continuous training group, there were 56% or 50% of people who were considered a responder compared to 67 in the non-diabetics. The diabetics completing the 4-HIIT protocol, so 63% of those were responders versus 91 of the non-diabetic. And then in the reduced HIIT protocol, 44% of those were responders. So again, similar percentage to the moderate intensity protocol. And that was in comparison to the non-diabetics, they were 58. So you can kind of see this blunted response we could find, or this was a trend we noticed. And we proposed that this was likely due to the pre-existing cardiovascular burden in people with type 2 diabetes. And there was perhaps some higher exercise volume needed to overcome this. So I think what this study tells us is that initially they can see benefit in those smaller protocols or those reduced volume protocols. And I think this is important when we're introducing HIIT to cardiometabolic populations as well, is that those small intervals may be beneficial, but overall we do need to introduce higher volume HIIT training to see those significant changes in cardiovascular outcomes and aerobic fitness as well. And I think that's an important educational tool we can use with clients, but also knowing that these higher volumes or this high intensity exercise in these populations is not only more effective, but safe to do with these clients as well. So I think it's a really important thing we can implement with clients, and it's easily done as well. I know most clients coming into a private clinical setting will be doing perhaps a warm-up prior to their session or some type of work on a treadmill or bike, and I think it's easily implemented into that part of our session to see those beneficial changes. So I'll link that study in the session notes. But that is all from me today, and I hope it's been helpful for informing you on HIIT practices for type 2 diabetes populations, but also other cardiometabolic populations you may be seeing. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this podcast, so remember to share, like, or follow to keep updated with all our podcasts and educational resources.